Thank you very much. It's good to be here with you this afternoon. A lot of people don't really understand what a toxicologist is, and there's many different kinds of toxicologists, but most toxicologists that work with poison centers are board-certified medical toxicologists. So we're physicians that have done a fellowship training program in toxicology. So we see, evaluate, treat patients with poisonings from a variety of sources, whether it's substances of abuse like we're going to talk about today, or whether it's environmental or occupational exposures. So it's a little bit of a nuanced area with only a few hundred of us that are board certified in North America. But we are out there, and we're almost all of us are associated with a poison center in one form or another, and we're all easily accessible. So with that, the topic that we're going to talk about today is, I kind of think about it as a sexy topic. People always like to think like, boy, what's going on in the street these days and what's happening out there? And it's exciting and tragic all in the same moment. So I think obviously the traditional slide, I don't have any commercial relationships and I'm not affiliated with any drug cartels, so I'm getting no kickback funds from anyone. Our objectives today are very familiar. But I think the most important thing to think about and identify with emerging drugs and abuses is this is a dynamic clinical problem. This changes week to week, month to month, year to year. So what I tell you today is probably not going to be very applicable in the spring or summer. Some things come back and recycle, and we'll look at that. But many things are evolving thanks to such a large amount of funding that cartels have in their laboratories to create many of these substances, and we'll see some of those. So there are several common categories of substances that we talk about, and it's kind of a busy slide, and we're going to go through most of these in general. But it really talks about stimulants, intoxications, opiates, and just more sort of traditional hallucinogens, if you will. Intoxications has been changed to really be more known as empathogens now. And David Nichols, he's the former chair of Purdue pharmacology. He changed that term because he thought the term pathos was a bit pejorative for these wonderful experiences that people are exclaiming, mostly with hallucinogens, as you might imagine. So we're going to talk about some of those areas. The first area I think we'll jump into is kind of the letter salad types of drugs. And a lot of these are with numbers and letters, and we'll describe why that happens in general. Many of you have probably heard about MDMA, which is Molly. MDMA is a hallucinogenic amphetamine, methylene methamphetamine, 2-CE, bath salts. Now, those are common, but in our world they're common in terms of the number of people abusing them in the United States. Those numbers probably aren't that dramatic. Opiates are really more of a problem that we deal with, and pure amphetamines. Many of the amphetamines and amphetamine derivatives that we'll talk about, like the letter and number salads, are phenylethylamines. So you see the structure over here. This is amphetamines here. This is phenylethylamine, and this is amphetamine here. And you see it's only one methyl substitution here on the side chain. And that's really how all of these drugs get changed, adopted, and modified. They just do ring substitutions or on the straight chain, just substitutions to that chain. And that's where many of these substances come out, and we'll see those and how they're evolved. But phenylethylamines typically are the majority of these synthetic drugs. And these really hit a high point and came to be in the 90s, and particularly the late 90s, with a surge of MDMA, or Molly, as a rave drug, and rave parties was really big at that time. Unfortunately, if you look at samples that you might analyze in the laboratory, most products or pills that are sold as MDMA or Molly is not pure MDMA. No surprise, right? So it's amphetamines, it's dextromethorphan that is a cough suppressant, it's benzylpiperazines, and can be a variety of other things in these. Sometimes it's SSRIs and atypical antipsychotic drugs that are compounded in these pills as well. Next generation of synthetics really are substituted tryptamines, the phenylethylamines, and the piperazines specifically. And there's so many here that each one of these categories could be a whole day-long seminar. And so our purpose is to kind of give you a sense of what's going on right now. It's interesting, if you think about what's going on in the streets right now, we started a website at the Rocky Mountain Poison Center through our RADARS program, which is looking at drug diversions and prescription abuse. And the website is called StreetRx. So if you just go to streetrx.com, it's fascinating. People that buy drugs can literally log into this website, register, and then tell you how much they paid for that particular drug that they bought on the street. So if you want to know what the price of Adderall is in Cincinnati, you can go in this website and see what people are entering. Now, it's obviously a biased sample, right? This is not a good epidemiologic sample because these are users, right? And so only ones that haven't sold their computers for drugs are logging in and giving the data. But it's quite interesting to see that you can get Adderall for anywhere from $10 to $30 in Seattle, or a dose of Librium or Valium or Fentanyl or whatever you might imagine. People literally put the price they paid in there. It's quite interesting to spend a couple of minutes to look at that. So streetrx.com. It's worth 5 minutes. So the tryptamines, boy, did they go back a long way in our history of drug abuse. And they've really come back out of the closet. Maybe in the last 15 years they've come back more, but they really came to be in the early 80s. So these are old drugs. The tryptamines are DMT, 5-MeO-DIP, 5-MeO-DMT, and these come from different plants and different natural products. DMT is a natural stimulant and hallucinogen. These are similar to psilocybin that you see in psilocybes, mushrooms, for example. You may have heard these from people that lick toads to get high. I know we all live in a sheltered world, but believe me, it happens. But these things were really very common in 2000, and then around 2000, the FDA made these illegal or outlawed their production, except for the natural products you can still get. This book that you see here, it's kind of a monograph, was put together by Alfred Most, and Alfred Most is the founder, get this, the founder of the Church of the Toad Light. Pretty interesting. That was in 1983 he wrote this monograph. And that's because they would celebrate the hallucinogenic properties of the DMT. It's really the 5-MeO-DMT that they would see in toads as part of the secretions of a toad venom that toads use to sort of keep their foe away. And that's pretty interesting. But even more interesting is that you can go online today and you can go to Reptile City, which is located in Honey Grove, Texas. And Reptile City is having a 2-for-1 special on toads. So you can go online and buy your own toads and have them delivered to your house. You got to be pretty committed to do that instead of just going, down to the quad and buying your drugs. But it's pretty interesting. So these are the tryptamines, and these are very common, and these are being modified. The side chain structures being modified commonly. So we have the psilocybin mushrooms, very common in the Pacific Northwest. In meadows, fields, you can find them really everywhere, probably most of your lawns. It's also common in toad venoms, the tryptamines, and of course in herbal teas. So dimethyltryptamine, DMT, this was really discovered in the 1960s. And this has become known as the businessman's lunch because it has a very sudden onset. Within about 5 or 10 minutes, the onset of the effect of the hallucinogenic and sympathomimetic effect. And it only lasts about 20 minutes to an hour. So it's quick on, quick off. So you can get high during lunch and then go back to work, which is pretty interesting. And so that's how it's become known as the businessman's lunch. DMT is commonly used in certain native populations in South America for its spiritual and medicinal purposes, as you might imagine, and it comes in various forms. And so you see it's only slightly different by this 5-membered ring attached. Otherwise, you have, looks like a phenylethylamine, right? You have the 6-membered ring, 2 carbons, and then a nitrogen group out here. All are very similar to amphetamines or phenylethylamines. Okay? Let's move on here. So DMT is metabolized by MAO, and MAO metabolizes it, monoamine oxidase, and metabolizes to indole acetic acid metabolites. They actually combine this, some people do, with MAOI inhibitors, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, to prolong the effect of it. So you prevent the breakdown, you get a longer duration of effect. This similarly was done with cocaine and organophosphates, which are an insecticide that prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine in the neuro and neuromuscular junction for cocaine, and you have a prolonged cocaine effect as well, which is pretty interesting. And they have a whole name for this, the pharmacology that they use when they combine it with MAOIs. Again, this isn't the most common thing we see, but these are out there. And the idea is to think about these as how are they going to change things next. So tryptamine pharmacology, if we think about these, are really similar to LSD as the classic tryptamine hallucinogen. They have direct agonist to 5-hydroxytryptamine 2A, so 5-HT2A and 1C are the primary receptors that increase serotonin. There's some dopaminergic effects as well. These are kind of the presenting symptoms you might see: empathy, euphoria, visual hallucinations, tachycardia. These people, if you haven't ever witnessed an LSD ingestion, they're usually quite calm, and they're kind of just sitting, often kind of quiet, kind of mute. It's a sympathomimetic, right? So they have little increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, dilated pupils, but they're just very mellow, and they're not talking much, and they're just kind of looking around the room, trying to see what's going on. And they can get agitated fairly quickly with this as well. And you can get seizures, and you can get rhabdomyolysis. You can get some pretty significant effects from these as well. But most LSD ingesting patients are actually quite calm and self-limited in what we need to do for them. So the management is supportive care. You know, I tell people we went into toxicology because it's kind of simple. You know, we have 30 antidotes, everything else is supportive care. Kind of think about that as simple. And I always tell my fellows, look, this is easy. You know your antidotes, and if you tell every patient needs supportive care or give advice for that, you can't go wrong. So that's true with this LSD and the tryptamines, and is that really there's no antidote, it's supportive care. You put them in a quiet room, make it a calm environment. They might need benzodiazepines to calm them down a little bit. But that's really about all they need, and then let the drug be metabolized off and they're okay. But most often they're not that really stimulated and aggressive. Some of the other drugs we'll see cause a lot of aggression and a lot of agitated delirium. So the phenylethylamines, this really goes back to Alexander Shulgin, and he published this book. It's kind of hard to see, it's PCAL, So it's PIHKAL. And PCAL stands for phenylethylamines I have known and loved. And that's where the name for the book came. So he's really the one who invented this term, and he's an organic chemist. And he chose the name 2C. Remember a few slides ago I said that there were some word and number salad names. And he uses the term 2C. And the reason for 2C is because there's 2 carbons here. Okay? And that's the whole reason. So there's 2C that go really from 2CB to 2CV. And it really depends on all the substitutions. So there's a huge number of 2C compounds that are out there. And so I list some names of some of them here. Mescaline falls into this. Tripsa, Beautiful, Europa, Seventh Heaven, the magic half dozen, Tranquility, Peace, Serenity for DOM. So there's a lot of different names that go with these, but primarily these are hallucinogenic amphetamines. They have an amphetamine-based structure with some hallucinogenic properties to them based on the substitutions either to the ring or the side chain. So interestingly, the pharmacology of phenylethylamines is somewhat similar to bath salts. Bath salts you've probably all heard about. Bath salts, we're going to talk about it a little bit more in detail as we go on here, but they really impact dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin release. It's kind of a non-specific releaser and reuptake inhibitor. And most of these ring substitutions increase the affinity for 5-HT2, so the serotonin receptors. And there are some agonist properties even at alpha-1, which think about alpha-1 drugs, alpha-1 agonists and antagonists. So this leads to changes, obviously, in blood pressure and mentation, pulse rate. So it's a hallucinogenic amphetamine. Well, there's many flavors and many colors, and these are just different examples of phenylethylamines that are known there, and you might pick up on the street. You obviously can't go by what a pill looks like or what the compound looks like. It's all in the analytical world trying to determine it. So if we really think we need to sort out what it is, and sometimes we do this for epidemiologic reasons, we'll have Jeff or someone analyze this and try to figure out what exactly is it that we're starting to see an outbreak of. And the state patrol lab also can do this for us at times as well. So here's a list of the symptoms that you see with the euphoria, the entactogen, the tachycardia, the paranoia, the delirium, bruxism, the grinding of the teeth, and the violent behavior that you see with it. Some of these can have really refractory seizures, and this has been seen with 2CI, which is another one of the drugs. In 2014, there's kind of a famous outbreak. There was a party with 20 kids in it, and they all got into a 25I Nibome, N-B-O-M-E, which is one of the phenylethylamines that you see this chemical structure of right there in the middle. And it was quite dramatic. 2 of the kids died. A 15-year-old and a 16-year-old died at the time. It was very difficult. Traditional tox testing could not determine what it was, and it took some time to really sort out what this was. And there was really no literature, and there really hasn't been much literature since then on the long-term effects of that particular drug. Again, they change over time, though. So what was then is not necessarily now. Here's a picture, if you look in the upper right part of the screen there. This is the picture of the medicine that they were taking. There's Z's. Those individual little pink letters are Z's. So let's come back to talk about Molly or MDMA a little bit. We talked about before that it's really never a pure form. Chronically, Molly can have really significant effect. There's some really interesting PET studies on abusers and in primates looking at 5-HT receptors in people that chronically abuse, or that in primates that are chronically given MDMA, where you see a destruction of the serotonin receptors and neurons in the brain. And you sort of do these serial PET scans, and you can literally see the neurons degenerating over time. And it can lead to these chronic psychosis in some of these patients. It can really have significant impairment in them. And so it's not just sort of a benign club drug. Molly can have really much more significant impact than even LSD. LSD we kind of think of as ho-hum. They're calm, they'll be fine. But chronic Molly use really is quite a different animal that we think about. Again, the management is to keep them calm, sedate them with benzodiazepines if you can. If they get hyperthermic, and that's one of the things that kills patients that have MDMA or Molly, is hyperthermia and hyponatremia. Okay? Body temperatures as high as 111 degrees have been reported in these abusers at times. Part of that is centrally generated as well as muscularly generated from the activity. So you need to rapidly cool them and deal with that. The hyponatremia issue is a bit confusing and not clear, because many of these patients, there's folklore that if you drink a lot of water, it'll help get it out of your system after you go to the rave party. There's also theories that you get really thirsty and it'll help the experience, and some people realize that you get really dehydrated because you're dancing like crazy at a rave party. We don't really know what it is. It clearly causes an SIDH, but we've also seen over-aggressive personal water intake. I had a young girl who drank something like 3 gallons of water after a rave and was significantly hyponatremic, about 116, I think her sodium was. And we've also seen therapeutic misadventures where people try to overhydrate them, and they use a hypoosmolar solution and they dilute them out significantly. So you kind of have to make an assessment of them, of when they come in and how they're treated. The street treatment is obviously a little bit different at parties. You know, you hydrate them, try to use balanced solutions, you know, Gatorade or Pedialyte or other sort of balanced salt solutions that you can buy are sometimes useful for that. Obviously in the hospital you can monitor their electrolytes a little closer and replete them as needed. So what's really in Molly? This is actually a website. It's called ecstasy-data.org, and Molly or MDMA is ecstasy. You've probably heard that term also. But if you go to ecstasy-data.org, they literally analyze samples that come in to try to figure out what is in the pills that people are being sold as Molly. Because like I said before, it's not always Molly. It's frequently amphetamines, can be methamphetamines, it can be dextromethorphan, it can be the phenylpiprazines. It can be a lot of different things that gets mixed with it. So that's a good source. Let's shift gears a little bit here to opiates. Opiates is kind of our, I wouldn't say it's our bread and butter, it's more of our ball and chain, I think. Opiates have become a real issue in America, and that's no news flash to any of you, I'm sure. And they go back to about 1500 BC. We know there's some writing in Egyptian medical papyrus at the time. There's some famous papyrus writings that are called the Ebers. And Ebers is really from George Ebers, an English gentleman who bought these papers in Luxor in 1873, so they're named after him. But they're about 1,500 years old. And it really talks about the medicinal properties of opiates going back 3,500 years, a long time ago. So these have been around a long time, and they will continue to be around a long time. Now, in 1914, the Harrison Act was put into effect in the United States, or making the non-medical use of opium and opiates illegal. And it's been modified since then, and that's the Harrison Narcotic Act. I like this street sign here from the streets of New York. It's kind of hard to read it all, but basically, last warning to all dope peddlers and gangsters, black, white, and Puerto Ricans, get out of Harlem in New York City. And it goes on to the time. This is around the time right when the Harrison Act was being enacted. And so it was a huge problem then as it is now. So the point of this is that it's not new, but perhaps it's new again. It's just changing the face a little bit. We refer to this as the non-medical use of opiates. And what we're really seeing now is a bit of a shift from pills to heroin to synthetic opiates. And that's really the shift we're kind of seeing here. And I illustrate that with this signed final page of Prince's autopsy report. And this truly is the artist formerly known as Prince, who died of a fentanyl overdose. And this suddenly shocked everybody. It's like, oh my goodness, where's he getting fentanyl? So fentanyl is very common. We're going to see a slide here in a few minutes about that. And it's really become the thing that we're having the most difficulty with. If you really look at its lethality and its prevalence. Well, where did the whole opiate thing, if you haven't really been sort of following the opiate story, how did this really get, how did we get where we are? How do we wind up prescribing 120 oxycodone to somebody, that's 90 years old with a hip fracture? How did this happen, How did we get there? And it's a long story that's been detailed in an interesting book that I'll show you in a few minutes, but it really comes back to this letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine, okay, that came out in 1974. And this is the famous Herschel-Jick paper. Herschel-Jick and Jane Porter, very famous clinicians who've done a lot of work with the Boston Collaborative Drug Project, who have looked at adverse drug reactions for a long time. And they kind of anecdotally looked at some of their information, and they made this statement, if you see in the right here. Basically, we conclude that the development of addiction is rare. Now, it seems like you wouldn't think that one letter to the editor changed our world of practice, but it did. And primarily the reason it changed it is because the pharmaceutical company that manufactured a particular opiate, oxycodone, used this in their marketing materials. So suddenly, drug reps, detail reps were going to physicians' offices saying, look, here's evidence. These are experts. They're saying, this is really rare. People don't get addicted to opiates. You can use them at will. And suddenly, we started prescribing. Then there was a time in the early Clinton administration where there was a lot of discussion and mandates about we're not adequately treating people's pain. A lot of this has to do with marketing, and it's quite sad and shocking when we look back on this now that we were sort of pulled into this. But, physicians, we share some of this blame, and we should share some of the solution as well. But I think it's important to think back on this to really see how this all happened that got steamrolled down this pathway. Okay, so let's switch from the pill form to fentanyl. This is really 2015. Now this is ancient history in toxicology, right? 2015 with emerging drugs abuse, ancient history. But you can see that most of the fentanyl activity and fentanyl deaths were occurring in the Central Valley, the Ohio Valley, Virginia, some in the Northeast, was really very prevalent. And since that time, it's just spread dramatically. And that's because of the drug cartels, pharmaceutical laboratories in Mexico, China, Thailand, Indonesia, where it's very easy for them to manufacture large amounts of drugs that they can then import. They don't have to worry about growing poppies. They don't have to worry about, going up and cutting coca leaves in the jungle. They can go into a factory and literally make all they want. So, about 3 weeks ago, in Puyallup, a minivan was stopped by the police. They found 40 pounds of drugs, 24 pounds of fentanyl, 24 pounds of fentanyl. So a typical dose is intravenously 25 to 100 micrograms. Oral, the oral popsicles, 100 micrograms, goes up to 600 micrograms. So if you think that a typical dose is 100 mics, that's about 100 million doses of fentanyl in Puyallup. 100 million doses. I really had to scratch my head and do the math like 5 times on that to really think that through. That's astonishing. Now that doesn't even count, the 2 pounds of heroin, right? Or the 12 pounds of methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, typical dose is also about 100 micrograms. On the street, it's called a point. Okay, 1/10 of a gram, a point. And it's an amazing thing to think about. So, 2015, seeing a lot of fentanyl in Ohio is completely changed now. It's now in our backyard. So let's come back to the oxycodone issue, because there's kind of an important history in this as well. In 2007, there was a huge lawsuit by the Drug Enforcement Administration, Department of Justice, against Purdue Pharmaceuticals for marketing indiscretions, if you will. It's about a $650 million fine. At the time, it was unbelievable. Since that time, with other pharmaceutical companies, there's been fines as high as $2 billion. So kind of makes this look paltry. But what that did, that fine, resulted in tamper-resistant or tamper-proof tablets of these extended-release formulations. So typically users crush these tablets. They like to snort them, they crush them, they inject them, all kinds of things like that. But the tamper-proof ones, you crush them, it doesn't enhance the release. Okay? So it wasn't so attractive on the street anymore, right? You can't get high. You want that whole buzz right away. You don't want it a sustained release. You want to get hit really hard. And so if you look at the sales and the street prices, you see that in 2011, when the formulation changed, the tamper-proof capsule came, we see that the sales and the price plummeted significantly. Now, oxycodone immediate release, or IR tablets, are 10, 15, 30 milligram. Like the extended release OxyContin are higher doses, and they have a stamped number on them. The milligram is stamped on the tablet. That's interestingly also the street price of the drug. So an Oxy 10 is worth $10 on the street. An Oxy 40 is worth $40. An Oxy 80 is worth $80 on the street. That kind of gives you a ballpark idea of how these have sort of progressed over time. So here's a slide of just the street RX that I mentioned a moment ago. This just shows some of the Seattle area, and it shows you some of the prices of the drugs here. So you can see Dilaudid tablet, $6 for a 2 milligram pill, and oxycodone. So you can just see the list there, and that's what you can find. That shows it nationwide. Again, it's kind of an interesting thing to spend a few minutes to look at. One of the other drugs that's been a real problem is called pink U477. Some people call it U4, like euphoria is also one of the other names. And And as you can see from this website picture, remarkably, you can buy it on the internet. Surprisingly, that has been decreased significantly, but it is available. It's also been on the rise with fentanyl, and it has similar types of potency as fentanyl as well. So there's really been a steady increase in opiate prescribing since 2006. If you look at the total number of prescriptions in 2012 in the U.S., it's over 250 million. So that's about 81 prescription for every 100 people. That's pretty alarming, isn't it? That's pretty alarming. So it's really increased. It decreased a little bit. In 2016, it dropped down to 66 per 100 people, but still over 214 million. So why did that happen? Why is it going down? And the answer is cartels got wind of this. It's like, you know, we can make heroin, we can make fentanyl for cheaper. So it went from prescription pills, doctors aren't prescribing the pills to you anymore, I still need to get high, I'll go to heroin, and then heroin and or fentanyl. So it's really switched from diversion of prescription pills to illicit drugs of heroin, and then to illicit production of fentanyl. So that's really why this has changed. So if you look at the, gee, that's great news, there's fewer opiate prescriptions, that's not the great news. The great news is they're shifting to fentanyl, which is much more potent, and people don't realize that when they buy it, and we're having many more opiate deaths. And that's why we're seeing Narcan being carried by first responders, police, by the lay public. You see them carrying naloxone. So it's sort of interesting. You know, in a quarter of the U.S. counties, there was an opiate prescription for every person in those counties. Some of the counties, some of the small towns, you have these pill mills, particularly like in West Virginia, eastern Tennessee. You'll see small towns. One town in particular had a population of about 380 people, and there was about 9 million pills dispensed from a pharmacy in that town in 1 year. That sounds like a problem. So it's really shocking, but it's still ongoing. If you really can't get enough of the fentanyl and opiate epidemic and really want to know more about the whole story, it's an interesting book called Dreamland, and it's available in book and audiobooks and everything. And Sam Quinone wrote this book. He's obviously a journalist, and he talked to many former dealers, many users, parents that have lost kids. And Dreamland is really about a small town in southern Ohio that they had a small water park, a swimming pool that the kids would go to in the summer that eventually poverty tore it apart, loss of economic options in the town, drugs came in, and this dreamland suddenly faded. And that's kind of the premise of where the story starts. But it's an interesting, maybe not the best literary novel out there, but it's quite an interesting story to read. You may or may not have heard about another opiate, desomorphine, called Crocodile. Crocodile is really an old drug. It was manufactured in, I think by Roche in 1934. And it came back in 2002, actually, because people that couldn't get heroin in the Soviet Union, but they could make desomorphine fairly easily from codeine and some acids and some iodine. It's about 10 times more potent than morphine, so it's quite effective. The problem is it's seemingly quite vasoconstrictive, it seems, or that there's a lot of impurities in this and it leads to just horrendous tissue destruction where these people inject. Now, we don't know that they're not having really bad cellulitis and necrotizing fasciitis, really bad infections in these sites as well, and it's probably a combination of everything. right? But they notoriously have caused these really terrible amputations. And you get kind of a greenish pus discharge in these wounds. And that greenish discoloration resembles a crocodile, and that's where it came from there. So time to switch gears a little bit here. For those of you who are Breaking Bad fans and ever watched that TV series, here's Walter White, who's Bryan Cranston, and Jesse Pinkman, who's Aaron Paul. And the story about this is that Bryan Cranston, or Walter White, is a chemistry teacher, high school chemistry teacher. Finds out he has lung cancer, I think it was, and worried that he can't provide for his family. And so he basically turns to his training and becomes a meth cook, and they start cooking meth, and it's in a mobile home, and it's a long, several-year TV series about production of methamphetamine that's kind of interesting and all the terrible things that go with it. Well, it's kind of an interesting story. But methamphetamines were developed in the 1800s. They've been used during World War II and in wars since then, Vietnam War, commonly used in pilots to keep them awake in small doses, 5 milligrams at a time. The two structures you see here are amphetamine, see one methyl group here, and methamphetamine down here, just for structure awareness there. Has all kinds of different street names: ice, crank, speed, glass, tweak. The crystals look glass-like, and so it's a little different than cocaine powder that's a little bit more opaque, and you can usually get a pretty good idea. They use pretty significant chemicals: sodium hydroxide and hydrochloric acid, some red phosphorus, and there's multiple different ways to produce it. But, you know, people will do it. There's a shake and bake method where they literally make it in soda bottles, and they'll do it in station wagons and vans, and I've seen all kinds of vehicles where we've fished sick people out of before that have been exposed to this. But it's very common, and it's still a common problem. So meth and amphetamines that can be snorted, injected, smoked, ingested, booty bumping, and I'll leave that to your imagination, or hot railing. Hot railing is they literally take a glass cup and they make a circle or a line of the methamphetamine. They then use a torch and heat up a glass bulb on the end of a plastic hose, and they heat that as hot as they can get it, the glass, and then that vaporizes the line, and they inhale the line, and it's a way of getting it in quickly to them. So obviously you understand the chemistry here. It's primarily dopamine and epinephrine, norepinephrine release, some euphoria, but a lot of agitation and delirium. The bad effects are agitation, delirium, and the sympathomimetic effects: heart attacks, strokes, bowel infarctions. You can see a variety of different things from this. Management, again, is to calm them down. And it kind of depends how agitated they are. Oftentimes we'll just use benzodiazepines. Sometimes you have to use short-acting beta blockers on them. Sometimes you have to give them a lot of fluids. Sometimes they're so agitated you can't deal with them at all, and for the real agitated, delirious patient, we'll use IM ketamine, which lasts about 20 minutes just to knock them down so we can get an IV in them and manage them appropriately. So they can be quite a problem. So there are laws about pseudoephedrine being out there, and you can only purchase a certain amount and that kind of thing. And that's monitored fairly closely. It's usually you get the phosphorus from matches is commonly one of the methods that they get, so they cut the match heads off and use that, and with strong acids and bases. There's a bit of hysteria about, meth labs when they go in and contaminated, and the houses being totally contaminated, and the drywall being impacted with all this. It might be a little overstated, quite honestly. Certainly you don't want to get splashed or spilled on from the liquid acids or bases or iodine, but for the most part they probably really haven't caused that much. So let's switch into synthetic cannabinoids now. We're going to pick the pace up a little bit. Synthetic cannabinoids are really what we think about with spice. You've heard the term spice. So this has been outlawed since 2012 in the state. And they have different kinds of faces on the products that you can buy. And these were sold at truck stops in a variety of places. So here's Mr. Nice Guy, and there's K2. Sometimes spice is called K2, and here just it's called spice, not even hidden. And this is J.W. Huffman, who is from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he'd done a lot of research on this, really in the early 60s, about using these for patients with cancer and HIV. So that's really where it came from. So he's done a lot of work on synthetic cannabinoids and cannabinoid 1 and 2 receptors. And it's really come to some more prominent forms. Chimica, which is about 16 times more potent than THC. And so we see spices getting more and more and more potent, as is THC being more and more purified. So the pharmacology of it reacts with 1 and 2 receptors, cannabinoid 1 and 2 receptors in both the central and peripheral nervous system, causes elevation of mood, some anxiety, some cognitive impairment. There's some evidence that it reduces inflammation, but that's not 100% true. That's just anecdotal from patients. So most of the information comes from case series, so not really very reliable. So as expected, like the other stimulants, tachycardia, hypertension, diaphoretic, they can get very similar to amphetamines, and the treatment is going to be very similar to them as well. The agitated delirium tends to be the biggest part, and they can be fighting like crazy, much like bath salts. And bath salts are cathinones. So they're somewhat similar, but they're more amphetamine-like. And they can be very agitated. It's sold as plant food, Snow White, just as bath salts. But the synthetic cannabinoids are really very significant. Some of this also is in the form of khat, which is a plant that grows primarily in the eastern part of Central Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. In Yemen, it's very common in the farming there. These are phenylalkylamines, not phenylethylamines, but phenylalkylamines. You see the double-bonded oxygen there on the side chain. And this is really what's really responsible for the amphetamine-like effect and the hyperactivity and the seizures and very agitated. So these were studied early in the last century, was used as antidepressants because it's really speed-like in the 30s, just like amphetamines were used in the United States. The only pharmaceutical cathinone that we have is bupropion that goes by the trade name Wellbutrin. So how are they made? They can either be made in a sophisticated laboratory or in a street lab. A lot of different names for these: khat, bath salts, ivory wave, vanilla sky, cloud 9, bubbles. The names go on. There's really almost no point trying to remember street names because they just change frequently. So they're beta-ketonated amphetamines, right, with that oxygen on the side there. A variable effect on serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, depending on the purity and really what else they mix with it, because they're not always pure. There is some MAOI inhibition with them as well, and so they increase concentrations of catecholamines at the synapses. Can be in powder, capsules, tablets. You can snort it, shoot it, smoke it, sleep with it, whatever you want. Onset's fairly quickly. Duration is kind of a moderate length, 1 to 6 hours. Frequently, it's adulterated with lidocaine or benzocaine, and we've seen methemoglobinemia with some of these patients as well. But these patients get really agitated. This top picture is somewhat blurred because this is a guy who killed someone who's literally eating them on the street. Their agitation is extreme, and over half of them are violently agitated, tachycardic, And so this kind of a situation, you need police when you're taking them down and restraining them. And then we typically use IM ketamine on the street until we can get them out to the point where we can really take control of them pharmacologically. As you can imagine, since it's such a prominent sympathomimetic effect, anything is possible with these people: seizures, hypertension, tachycardia, strokes, etc. Psychosis is also a significant thing. They can get very paranoid. So that's a very bad situation where you have a very violent paranoid person. It's almost like PCP from back in the day, very violent paranoid people where they would stab themselves and jump off of bridges and do all kinds of crazy things. And the excited delirium is really a major problem with these patients. So protect yourself. Always remember the ABCs. When anything emergently, there's really no antidote. There's no reason to decontaminate them. Benzodiazepines or ketamine. Haloperidol may increase seizure risk in them. And so one of the first things we do is we try to put them down as quickly as we can, intubate them, and take control of them so they're not taking control of the ER. Katorum is a natural plant that is very opiate-like. It's a lot of availability on the web. There's a lot of push to make it legalized in this country and in others. It's about 10 times more potent than morphine. So it's quite an issue as well, but it hasn't really hit so much in Washington. I think the last patient we had was in July of this year. Something you may not think of is loperamide. Yes, the anti-diarrheal medication. Kids buy it, kids abuse it because it's a mild mu receptor agonist, just like other opiates. So be on the lookout for that. It can cause QT prolongation in the EKG, and they can have really violent cardiac arrhythmias like methadone and some of the other ones. It's really sort of massive ingestions. You're really talking about, multiple pills and sometimes 100 pills of it to get really high. So there's many other things to think about in the world of emerging drugs. Things that they can get their hands on. Diphenhydramine, Benadryl, right? Dextromethorphan. Dextromethorphan and cough syrup that we were just talking about. So kids call that, it comes with a little cup on the cough syrup top. Kids call that robo-shots. So Robitussin, shots of Robitussin. Robo-shots or robo-tripping or triple Cs is very common, very, very common. We're getting into the holiday season, so nutmeg is always out there as a LSD-like hallucinogen to think about. Morning glory seeds are uncommon. For the most part, our problem really is around bath salts and fentanyl and methamphetamines are the big issues. So I think I'm over just a couple minutes here, and I just want to say Poison Center is always here to help you. There's always a physician on staff, a boarded medical toxicologist. If you have questions about a case, we'd love to hear from you and help you and collaborate with you and pick your brains because, we're sort of deficit on the analytics side, and we can always use help on that end. We're pretty good on the clinical side, but we need help on that side. So with that, I'll end and take any questions that you might have. And I will say that I'm a little hard of hearing, so I'm not offended by you shouting at me if you have a real question.
Hey, thanks, that was great. It's just one quick question, since it was more of a survey that we heard about, but obviously there's things that we can test for that you mentioned, and then there's a lot of things that we can't. Well, if you had anything in general to say, like, how would you like the lab to help you in this? What would you tell us? What can we do for you when there's a bunch of those weird things out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. That always comes up like, can we do it and then should we do it? How does it help the case? Not just me, but how does it help the case? If it's a 22-year-old frat boy who gets high and he's recovering, does that really help by having a lot of analytics on that person? Maybe not necessarily. But if it's a 2-year-old child who gets into mama's stuff and it becomes a legal issue or an abuse issue or a child custody issue, those are the kind of cases that we really need your help in trying to identify what it was, with good chain of custody to really sort it out, because those oftentimes really get into trouble. The other place that would be very helpful is if we're starting to see similar toxic syndromes emerge in the community, something new with a given set of signs and symptoms and laboratory features that we can't quite put our fingers on, and then speak to someone like Jeff and say, what do you think? This is what we're seeing. How does that fit? We think it might be in this sort of category of substances. And oftentimes that's good epidemiologically and from a public health perspective as far as finding out what's going on as well.
So in Washington State, we recently had a legal referendum about legalization of marijuana, and there's pushes. You mentioned push to legalize some of these other substances versus, combating them and criminalizing them. Do you think there's what's the best public health way to deal with these, from your opinion?
Public health, as far as like marijuana, for example, or
just in general.
Just in general, it's a really difficult question, legalization of substances. I've had a chance in a 30-year career as a toxicologist to see kind of all sides of that. And I quite honestly will tell you, sometimes I flip-flop between should we just decriminalize it, take the money and the violence out of it, because so many people are killed because of the violence, or should we do everything we can to fight and resist it. But obviously, the way that states are sort of voting, Colorado and Washington, are voting to allow or decriminalize certain drugs, the public has an appetite for it. And whether it's decriminalizing everything, I think most people would probably draw certain lines. I'm not sure that they want their kids shooting up desomorphine, or things like that. But it's a very difficult topic, and I'm conflicted. I think just like most of us in medicine are.